Did you know that while 800,000 Ontarians struggle to find work and youth unemployment has skyrocketed to 18%, Premier Doug Ford's official response was to tell young people to just look harder. But that's just the tip of the iceberg in what's shaping up to be the most devastating economic and housing crisis Ontario has ever faced. Today we're diving into the 10 most shocking revelations about Ontario's housing market collapse and Doug Ford's desperate battle to save the province. What you'll discover at number 5 will blow your mind. And number 1 is the most important because it reveals whether Ontario can survive as Canada's economic powerhouse, or if we're witnessing the beginning of its transformation into something completely unrecognizable. Number 10. The employment apocalypse behind the housing crisis. Here's a statistic that should terrify every Ontario family. 800,000 people are currently unemployed in this province. But what makes this truly shocking isn't just the number, it's the government's response. When MPP Dolly Begum stood in the Legislative Assembly and pointed out that youth unemployment had jumped from 15.5% to nearly 18% in just 4 months, Doug Ford's solution was to tell young people to look harder for jobs. Think about the devastating irony here. We have a housing affordability crisis where young families can't afford homes, and simultaneously we have nearly 1 in 5 young people unable to find work. This isn't a coincidence. It's a perfect storm that's destroying the foundation of Ontario's future. When young people can't find jobs, they can't buy homes, they can't start families, and they can't contribute to the tax base that funds the very infrastructure needed to build more housing. But here's what's truly alarming. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This represents hundreds of thousands of real families facing impossible choices. Do you move away from Ontario to find opportunity? Do you delay starting a family because you can't afford housing? Do you move back in with your parents at 30 because there's no other option? The psychological and social impact of this crisis is creating a lost generation, and Ford's response is to blame them for not trying hard enough. Number 9. The construction industry meltdown. While politicians argue about policy, an entire industry is collapsing before our eyes. Housing starts across Ontario have crashed to levels that industry veterans say they've never seen before. In Toronto alone, new construction starts plummeted 58% in the first 5 months of 2025. But the real shock isn't just in the numbers, it's in what this means for the skilled workforce that builds Ontario. Construction workers who spent years developing specialized skills are being laid off by the thousands. Equipment sits idle on lots across the province. Suppliers are canceling orders and closing warehouses. This isn't just a temporary downturn, it's the systematic dismantling of the construction ecosystem that took decades to build. Once these workers leave the province or change industries, once the specialized equipment is sold off or moved elsewhere, rebuilding this capacity could take years. What makes this particularly devastating is the timing. Ontario needs more housing than ever before, but just when demand should be driving massive construction projects, the industry is shrinking. It's like watching a city burn while the fire department goes out of business. The skills shortage that could result from this collapse might make the current housing crisis look mild, compared to what's coming in 5 or 10 years, when Ontario desperately needs to rebuild its construction capacity. Number 8. The municipal budget catastrophe. Hidden beneath the housing headlines is a municipal budget crisis that could devastate Ontario communities for decades. Cities and towns across the province depend on development charges, land transfer taxes, and property tax assessments to fund basic services. When housing sales drop by 90% and construction stops, these revenue streams don't just decline, they virtually disappear overnight. Toronto is staring at budget shortfalls that could force massive cuts to public transit, road maintenance, and community services. Smaller municipalities are facing even worse scenarios, with some considering dramatic property tax increases just to maintain basic operations. But here's the truly frightening part. Municipalities provide the infrastructure that makes housing development possible in the first place. Water systems, sewers, roads, and public transit all depend on municipal budgets. If cities can't maintain existing infrastructure, how can they support new housing development? We're looking at a vicious cycle where housing market collapse leads to infrastructure decline, which makes future housing development more expensive and difficult. Some municipalities are quietly discussing scenarios where they might not be able to provide basic services to all residents, effectively shrinking their developable land base and making the housing shortage even worse. Number 7. The demographic time bomb. Something unprecedented is happening in Ontario that could reshape the province's future permanently. For the first time in generations, young professionals are leaving Ontario faster than they're arriving. This isn't just about housing costs. It's about opportunity, lifestyle, and the ability to build a future. When a software engineer in Toronto realizes they can buy a house in Calgary for half the price while earning similar wages, the math becomes pretty simple. But the ripple effects go far beyond individual decisions. Universities are reporting increased interest from Ontario students in out-of-province programs. Immigration patterns are shifting as newcomers to Canada increasingly choose other destinations. The demographic data shows a province that's aging rapidly while losing the young, educated workforce that drives economic growth and innovation. What's particularly alarming is how this affects the housing market itself. Older residents typically want to downsize, but if there are fewer young families to buy their larger homes, the entire market can stagnate. We could end up with a province full of empty nest baby boomers sitting in houses they want to sell to young families who have moved to other provinces. This demographic inversion could make the housing affordability crisis permanent. Number 6. The infrastructure impossibility. Here's something flying completely under the radar that could prove more important than all the policy debates combined. Ontario's basic infrastructure is reaching capacity limits that make massive housing expansion physically impossible in key areas. The electrical grid, water treatment systems, and transportation networks were designed for a much smaller population and are already operating at or beyond their safe limits in the Greater Toronto Area. Engineers and urban planners are privately discussing scenarios that politicians don't want to acknowledge publicly. Adding the million-plus new homes that Doug Ford's government says are needed would require infrastructure investments measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. That's not just expensive, it may be financially impossible given current federal and provincial fiscal constraints. We're talking about rebuilding Ontario's foundational systems, while those same systems are already struggling to serve existing residents. The timing creates an impossible catch-22. The housing market collapse is devastating government revenues just when massive infrastructure spending is desperately needed. Meanwhile, without infrastructure capacity, housing development becomes exponentially more expensive, making affordability problems even worse. Some experts believe Ontario may have reached the physical limits of development in key areas without a complete rethinking of how the province grows. Number 5. Doug Ford's housing policy reversals and contradictions. This is where Doug Ford's fightback strategy gets truly fascinating and reveals just how desperate the situation has become. In March 2024, at 0:30 in a CP24 interview, Ford categorically declared that fourplexes, small apartment buildings that experts say are crucial for housing affordability, are off the table for his government. His exact words, "It's off the table for us. We're going to build homes, single-dwelling homes, townhomes, that's what we're going to focus on." But here's what makes this shocking. Fourplexes were specifically recommended by Ford's own Housing Affordability Task Force as essential for addressing the crisis. The federal government has made fourplex approval a requirement for infrastructure funding. Cities across North America are embracing this missing middle, housing as the key to affordability. Yet Ford rejected his own experts' advice because he was worried about a lot of shouting and screaming from communities. This isn't just a policy disagreement. It reveals a government that's more afraid of political backlash than committed to solving the housing crisis. Ford is simultaneously claiming to fight for housing while rejecting the tools experts say are necessary to build affordable housing. It's like declaring war on cancer while refusing to allow chemotherapy because patients don't like how it makes them feel. Number 4. The banking sector's secret warnings behind closed doors. Canada's major banks are having conversations about Ontario's economy that would shock most residents if they knew what was being discussed. Multiple sources in the banking industry report that mortgage default rates are climbing faster than public statistics indicate. And banks are quietly implementing lending restrictions that go beyond government stress test requirements. What's truly alarming is that some major financial institutions are internally projecting Ontario housing price declines of 30–40% from peak levels over the next 2 years. These aren't public forecasts because banks can't risk triggering panic selling, but their internal risk management decisions are based on scenarios that assume a prolonged and severe economic downturn that extends far beyond housing. The implications are staggering. If banks are right, millions of Ontario homeowners could find themselves owing more on their mortgages than their homes are worth. New lending could virtually stop, making economic recovery nearly impossible. The banks themselves could face losses requiring government intervention, potentially triggering a financial crisis that makes the housing collapse look like just the first domino to fall. Number 3. The regional economic collapse. While Toronto dominates headlines, a devastating pattern is emerging across Ontario's smaller cities and towns that could reshape the province's entire economic geography. Cities like Windsor, Sarnia, and Thunder Bay aren't just experiencing housing market downturns. They're facing economic hollowing out that threatens their long-term viability as communities. The General Motors plant closure in Ingersoll serves as a perfect example of how quickly things can unravel. Thousands of well-paying manufacturing jobs disappeared overnight, devastating not just workers but the entire local economy. Real estate values collapsed, young families fled to other provinces, and local businesses closed as spending power evaporated. What's terrifying is that this scenario is playing out across multiple Ontario communities simultaneously. We're witnessing the creation of what economists call economic sacrifice zones, places where normal economic activity becomes unsustainable. When young people leave these communities for opportunities elsewhere, the demographic profile shifts toward older residents who require more services while contributing less to the tax base. Eventually, entire regions could become economically unviable, leaving Ontario with a few expensive urban centers surrounded by declining rural and small-town areas. Constitutional crisis. Something unprecedented is brewing that could fundamentally alter the relationship between federal and provincial governments in Canada. Doug Ford's housing policies are increasingly conflicting with federal requirements for infrastructure funding, immigration targets, and climate commitments. The fourplex rejection is just the beginning of what could become a constitutional crisis over who controls housing policy in Canada. The federal government provides billions in infrastructure funding and has committed to specific immigration targets that require housing capacity Ontario says it can't provide. Meanwhile, Ford's government is rejecting federal requirements while demanding federal money. This isn't sustainable, and behind the scenes, both levels of government are preparing for conflicts that could end up before the Supreme Court of Canada. If this escalates to a full constitutional crisis, Ontario could find itself cut off from federal housing and infrastructure funding just when it desperately needs those resources. The legal and political battles could paralyze policy-making for years while the housing crisis deepens. We could be witnessing the beginning of a fundamental realignment of Canadian federalism, with Ontario at the center of the storm. Number 1. The economic transformation point of no return. What's happening in Ontario isn't just a housing crisis or an economic downturn. It's a fundamental transformation that could permanently alter the province's role in Canada and North America. Ontario has been Canada's economic engine for generations, but the convergence of housing unaffordability, job losses, demographic shifts, and infrastructure limitations is creating conditions that could end that dominance forever. Here's the most shocking reality. We may already be past the point of no return. The combination of young talent leaving the province, construction industry collapse, municipal budget crises, and infrastructure limitations creates a downward spiral that becomes harder to